Well, I shared with you how I was brought up to understand what Labor Day was all about. But I wonder if you really have any clue on why we have a Labor Day and where it all started from and where it might all end. Well, believe it or not, it actually began in the late 1800s. Not necessarily as a national holiday, but as a couple of people who began to say, you know what? We need a day. Now listen to this for a moment. We need a day that constitutes a yearly national tribute to the contributions workers have made to the strength, prosperity, and the well-being of our country. We need a day to celebrate the contributions that we have done. I sat on that for a while, and there's a part of that statement that bothers me. Kind of reminded me of a passage in Genesis 11 where the people said, man, we are so good, let's build a tower to God. And we can ascend into the heavens. God took a look at that and said, not so fast. He destroyed their tower and scattered them with different languages. I struggle in our society today, and I think you do too. In a year in which we have to elect a presidential candidate, that the choices have reached an all-time low. I struggle in our country, with our country today, that has gotten to the point where we think we are so great, we don't need God. And yet everywhere you go, society has worse issues today than for years. And I wonder sometimes if it's not because we've got this whole labor thing messed up. And I know that labor is not really a fun idea. Hey, we're going to have a church work day Saturday, and we want you to come because we got to redig the trench lines for the sprinklers. How many's coming? Yeah, that'll be the pastor again. There's a thing about work we don't like, isn't there? Well, let's just bear with me for a moment, because I want to talk to you about God's original design for a moment. Here we are in Genesis chapter 1, where God created man, and he says to him, says, then God said, let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, the livestock and all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. There was a sense in which God created man that he gave him mankind, a sense of purpose and a sense of significance. And it was to be found in work. Now, the interesting thing about this whole thing was that there was responsibilities that Adam and Eve had prior to the fall of mankind that did not become tough to do. Because we think of work, we think of it synonymous with all the curses. We think about sweating, we think about doing things we don't like, we think about no significance to it whatsoever. What's this ever going to matter? Like, wives, how many times have you cooked a meal and cleaned the clothes only to have to do it over again? How many times do you mow the yard, guys, and hey, it needs mowed again? But they had a sense of belonging, a sense of significance in this whole beginning of work. It wasn't until there had to be a redesign to the program. Plan B, as we often call things. That Adam and Eve decided that they weren't going to follow God's plan and there was something better for them. And if they would just rush the process, they could have a better life and be as wise as God. They could be superhuman beings. And after a lot of prodding, sitting beside the wrong tree and being in the wrong place and listening to the wrong voice, Eve one day said, "Sure, I'll eat that fruit." And then she said to Adam, "Hey, nothing's happened. Have a bite. It tastes really good." Adam went, "Okay, whatever you say, dear." And some things immediately began to happen. They lost their fellowship with God. They got an incredible amount of negative feelings. And then God said these things to the woman. You know that joy of giving birth? It's going to be painful. If you talk to Gary right now, his statement to me yesterday was, the baby hasn't been born yet. Meaning, I've had everybody tell me that this is the greatest pain closest to childbirth that a man can experience. So the baby has not been born yet. He looked at Adam and said, you know all this stuff you've been doing around here and it's brought you great joy and you felt significance from it? You're going to start sweating like crazy. And taking care of this garden that I put you in, well, first of all, it's not going to happen, but when you get outside of it, you're going to have weeds to pull and cultivate. Now, I notice we don't have a lot of people signing up for our weed pulling ministry. We have some really good-hearted people that do that, but it's not something we just love to do, is it? I crack up every time I see the video clip that talks from the 1920s that talks about, in the 40s, that talks about someday we will develop technology so much that we'll only have to work 4 days a week. He says, this ground, it's going to grow thorns and thistles for you that you will eat by its grains, and by the sweat of your brow you will have food to eat until you return to the ground. And it just doesn't even sound very appetizing. You're going to get up, you're going to work, you're going to sweat, you're going to get old, your bones are going to dry up, and you're going to return to dust. Boy, isn't that good news? Aren't you so glad you came to hear good news this morning? Somebody told me when I left that it wasn't a happy sermon the last time I was here, so make it happy. But listen to me for a moment. Work became necessary. It became toilsome. It became sweaty. And we've even turned it into an attempt to control. And in a sense, we have often made work our God. Then we come to a whole new different thing where we come to the point where people don't want to work and refuse to work. And we've turned this whole thing into our sense of identity, haven't we? Well, what do you do? Who are you? The first question we ask somebody is, who are you? And the first thing they say is, well, I'm a weed puller. Oh, you don't have a very good job, do you? Oh, you're a doctor. Oh. That's not who we are. That's what we do. We've made our whole significance, our identity, and we just want to retire and do nothing. But then Jesus came along with a new design, didn't he? He came along and said, first and foremost, you're significant because I love you. Have you ever noticed that? That one of the greatest things in our lives that we want more than anything else is to know that we are loved. You may not be aware of this, but seriously, you want to be loved. Why do you think terrible twos, just spent some time with a 2-year-old grandson, why do you think terrible twos are called terrible twos? Why do you think nobody wants to teach the junior high Sunday school class? Because there's a couple of age spans where everybody's wanting attention and wanting to be loved. And unfortunately, they choose some ways that love comes differently. You with me? They would rather be disciplined, yelled at, spanked, put in the corner, and get any type of an emotional response rather than just, it's a terrible two. He's going through a phase. I hear the story told of a Navy ship that had a dog, and they decided to try an experiment. An experiment was they were going to feed the dog and water the dog and make sure he had facilities, but they weren't going to give him any attention. If the dog was laying on the ground, they would step over it. They wouldn't pet it. You know what happened to the dog? He died. More than anything, we want to have a sense of being loved. And if we can find a ways in which God becomes real to us to fill our sense of love, we can stand up to a lot of stuff around us. Jesus explained this way to his disciples, and it's in chapter 4 of John. It's a really fascinating story. It's most famous for when Jesus sat down beside a well and sent the disciples into McDonald's, and a woman came out, and he began this whole cross-cultural conversation with her that she's shocked that he initiated. And the disciples came back, and they were really concerned that he'd gone a long time without food, and they wanted to feed him. And he says, I have food that you don't know about. My nourishment comes from doing the will of God who sent me and from finishing his work. You know the saying that 4 months between planting and harvest, but I say, wake up and look around. The fields are already ripe for the harvest. The harvesters are paid good wages, and the fruit they harvest is people brought to eternal life. What joy awaits both the planter and the harvester? What is Jesus saying? That we shouldn't eat? I think he's saying we shouldn't try to consume everything around us to fulfill our sense of purpose, our sense of identity, and our sense of contentment in this world. And he says that by the fact we need to understand that part of what we need to be doing, no matter where we're going, is looking out at ripe harvest fields. The first thing he says is we need to pray that God would raise up harvesters for the harvest. And it's interesting. I listen to pastors everywhere, and I even join in the conversation from time to time about the need for people to serve God in churches. Because it's all about a harvest. Do you know that we have people in our church that came because they drove by the building and said, hey, that looks like a nice place to go to church? Do you know it only looks like a nice place to go to church because of the people that keep it looking that way? That most of you never see sitting on a lawnmower or running a weed eater or pulling a weed? The second church I attended while I was on vacation, it took me 5 minutes to realize I never ever wanted to go back. I've heard it within 12 minutes, people decide whether they ever want to return to a church or not. So that means everybody sitting in the coffee shop, that means everybody you see, that means everybody you're talking to, you probably have an influence on. I think we need to really think more than just getting up and going to work and being 9 to 5 or any of that stuff. We need to begin to realize that our job is there so that we can do the work of God. And I know, a lot of your places of employment now have rules. You can't talk about faith or you can't talk about Jesus. But I want to tell you something, where there's a will, there's a way. Where there's a Holy Spirit leading, there's a right way to do it. And this whole new design is about a relationship with Jesus Christ rather than just a job. God has you where you're at for a purpose because there's people around you. Think about your neighborhood for a moment. How many people in your neighborhood on a given Sunday morning don't even think about church? How many of your co-workers are lost today? They're not only lost in this world, they're lost about the one to come. We need to think about leaving a legacy. Well, how do we really get our work to become significant and satisfying? How do we really find our place to work within the kingdom? I'm convinced that God began to make you into a certain shape inside your mother's womb. He began to shape you. In fact, he tells Jeremiah that. When God asked Jeremiah to become this young preacher, Jeremiah's response was, "I'm just youthful. What are you thinking, God? You got to be kidding me. I can't do that." And God says to him, "While you were yet in your mother's womb, I shaped you. I began to make you into who I needed to be." And part of this shape that we need to look at when it comes to laboring for the kingdom and seeing the fruit is we need to understand what our giftedness is. You know, when I came to Christ, I didn't want to be a preacher. There's still days I don't want to. I keep thinking I'll grow into it more, but you know what? I was a businessman. I ran a business. And God began to tell me that he had created me for better things than pounding nails and fixing houses. And he began to put into me a gift and a desire to share through public speaking and caring for people. And it was a spiritual gift. But along with that goes a passion. I think sometimes when we start asking about, well, what shape look like and what is this whole giftedness about? What is my passion? You know, I think we all tend to have a passion for Christ. But when it really comes to serving and caring for him, what do I have a passion for? You know, what do I really care about? Do I care about kids? Do I care about them learning to know Jesus loves me? There's a better life than what the world offers. Do I care about teenagers and all of their obnoxiousness? Do I care about making sure this building looks right and it's clean and it's fixed up and it's operational? That when we come in here, the air works, sound system's clean. A passion. We all have different passions about how this works. And fortunately, it talks about personalities. Because you know what? We all have different personalities, don't we? There's some people who should not be greeters. Let's just face it, okay? I was kidding Pauline this morning that she makes a great greeter because she loves the pastor. Well, that's important. You don't want somebody standing at the right door saying, the music's great, but then the preacher comes on. You don't want that, okay? You don't want them saying, you know, Gary's funny and we have a good time, and then that old preacher gets up there. You see what I'm saying? We don't want Mr. Grumpy out there, okay? We want people out there that know how to smile. Let their light shine. And guess what? There should never be a retirement from serving God. Change, and our personalities might change over our lifetime, but there's no retirement plan. Because it takes everybody working together. And when somebody comes into our church who's seeking more than where they're at. And somebody cares for them and smiles at them, and the band or the music catches their attention, and the preaching ministers to them, or their kids were excited about Kids World. Guess what? It is because the body of Jesus Christ has done its thing. And whether you were praying or whether you were actually physically doing something, God was using you in the process to leave a legacy. And guess what I was reminded of on my trip? Influence to people often takes a lifetime to realize. Let me illustrate that. When I went to the first church, and that wasn't the first church of AD 14, the pianist, keyboardist, after church made this statement. Don't you remember when I started coming and you baptized me after I gave my life to Christ? I've been here 35 years. I love this church. I've walked through the ups and the downs of the journey, but I love this church. And then there was that other opportunity when our former foster daughter called and just told us how important it was that she would really see us. And she says, I live just off the interstate. When I found out which interstate it was. Now you got to understand something about me when it comes to driving. I'm kind of get it naturally from our father, okay? When it comes time to come home, I'm going home. And the closer my dad got to home, the faster he drove, okay? I don't wait till I get home, close to home, to start driving faster. I'm driving. You got it? Understand it? So now I'm asked to go out of my way. I was warned by a passenger that when we got to Patty's house, who was a very interesting 16-year-old when she came to live with us, spacey would be a polite word, challenging would fit. But I was warned when we got there that I should be in good spirits. When I got there and she wasn't even home, I was in good spirits. Because 5 of her 6 kids greeted us, or no, 4 of the 6 kids greeted us. And we had a delightful time on the porch. And I began to see things in her life and her faith that was incredibly, incredibly rewarding. She even looked at me and she says, remember how you have this passion about Sunday should be a day of rest because it's God's day? I just want you to know that we start on Saturday. We shut everything down. We quit doing homework. We quit doing this. We quit doing that. And we even start singing. And the kids had to bring out all their instruments and play and talk about their faith. I want to leave a legacy. I don't want to quit. I want to find this whole thing about labor as being something significant. Paul wrote to his young understudy Timothy, work hard so you can present yourself to God and receive his approval. Be a good worker, one who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly explains the word of truth. You and I need to understand deeply that all around us are ripe harvest fields. I still love the Ray Boltz song where the guy goes to heaven, begins to see all the people that he had influenced. It's going to be amazing that there'll be some people from the Dominican Republic that look at some of you and say, I'm here today because you gave. I'm here today because you came. There'll be people in this community that say, I'm here because that church existed and somewhere you were in that process. I don't want to get to heaven and have nobody sitting at my table. Because it's not an ollie in free. It's only for those who come to know the love of Jesus Christ and live in Him. There's a challenge for you this morning. Highlands Community Church is not just about existing. It's about creating a living organism of people who are willing to do something to make it happen. And that may be giving, and that may be serving in a ministry somewhere. It may be for now just to find a place to find some healing for your heart, and that's okay. Or it may even be a place to, right now, I just need to know whether I'm in this faith thing or not. I don't know if I can buy that a God would allow part of Him to die on a cross for somebody. That just doesn't make sense to me. The God would just wipe everybody out. And maybe you're just seeking to find that relationship, and that's okay. But for some of the rest of us, we need to be a part of that. Because I want to tell you another story about an old buckboard. Now, I don't know if any of you remember riding those or not. But you know what I'm talking about. What's an old wagon. And the wagon parts one day got into an argument about who was the most important. And the seat said, well, obviously I am because I hold the driver and the passenger. And if without them they wouldn't. And the bed says, oh no, I'm what's carrying the important load. And without me there would be no load that got delivered. And the wheel said, oh, but without me. And that harness and reins and would say, yeah, but without us, there's no connection to the power. And finally, pun intended, the nut that held the wheel on spoke up and said, without me, it all falls apart. Now, I guess this morning I'm asking you to be a nut in this church. Because you don't have to be crazy and nuts to come to it, but it sure helps. And all I'm asking today is that you would consider talking about what nutty job you can do in the service of the kingdom. Because our labor is not done yet. And there is a fulfillment that comes when you see the lives of people changed. But guess what? It doesn't happen without work. If you've been around me enough, you know to say starting this church was the funnest job I've ever had in my life. I was built for it. I was shaped for it. I love it. And it's the second hardest job I've ever done in my life. Because it just didn't go boom. And so today, we're going to take an offering. We're going to do a twofold offering. One is we need your gifts of cash, checks, money orders, whatever. Okay, it's summertime in Sebring.